Okay, so hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain how a child component can communicate to its parent component. We already are very well, we must be very aware how a parent communicate to its child, right? So here I have a lot of components. Let's don't get overwhelmed with them. I'm creating an expense creator, expense tracker app. Okay, so in that I have one of the component new expense. Okay, let me delete this for the time being. No worries, I'm going to explain this here. I'm going to explain this again. Okay, so now, right? So new expense form, new expense. Okay, new. We have two files. I'm gonna take use of two files, new expense.js and expense.js. Let's delete every other file. Let's not delete. Let's get rid of them. Okay. Now app.js, you already know that the main root file. Now I have this new expense.js. Okay, which is the parent file of the expense form. How it is parent? Because it is calling the expense form here. Okay, so this is a child form, child component expense form, and new expense the parent component. Now in the expense form, I have created a form. Okay, in that you can see I have a title. Okay, in which I'm accepting the title of the expense, and then I'm asking for amount. Okay, then I am expensing for the date on which the expense was occurred. So in that way, I'm taking inputs from the user and then logging it onto my system. Right. So this was the main motto here. Now, what is happening here? Like in this child component expense form, I'm taking all these inputs from the user. Right now, the title, the number, and date. Okay, using the use state function. You must be very aware about this use state function. In this video, we're not going to talk about it. Okay, so using that, I'm creating these initial states, and then whenever any changes occurs in them, I am setting their values here in that form. Okay, so without going into the deep here, let me tell you what I want. Now on clicking the button of the form, I want that the expense data variable that I'm creating here using the values, enter title, entered amount, entered date. These values are entered by the user. I've created an object. I want this object to move to this parent component. I want that object here in this my parent component. That is what I wanted here. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. Okay, now this is nothing new. If you will observe carefully, we are already doing this communication from child to parent a lot of time. For example, in this child component expense form only, what we're returning a form element, right? And in that we have this. Suppose we have this support. Suppose we have here an input component, right? So although input is an inbuilt component, right? But we can also make it as an another component and we can write it into another file, can't we? So here we can say that for the expense form parent, this input tag is the child component. Right now, in this child component, we are passing the values, and you're seeing that whatever values we are entering into this input field, we are able, but where it is, we are able to retrieve them here. Okay, whenever there are some changes into that input field, like title change handler, amount change handler, all these are input field. Title change, amount change, and data change handler, all these are input field, right? Here there are three inputs: input for title, input for amount, and the input for date. Okay, let's go through for this first one only, title. So right, so we are using the values entered into the child component, okay, into the parent component. So using the same concept, we can also use the variable created in this child component expense form into the parent component new expense form. How? Let us see. First, understand this child component input of this expense form. Okay. Now in this child component input, we are passing an prop on change. Okay. Although it is an inbuilt component, but let's say it is an prop, right? Isn't it? And it is a prop starting with on, and it will take a function as a value, and that function will execute whenever there is some change in that input field, isn't it? This is how it works. And this function we are defining it above, title change handler and it will take event as an argument. Where will this value come? This value will come whenever this event will execute it. Whenever there will be some change into the input field, the event will execute, and this are the argument the event will come as an argument, and this event, and we can do the things like event.target.value to update the value of that input field, right? To update the title. So that way we can do the things. Okay, so this is how this one is working, isn't it? Now, by default, it is executing automatically whenever there is change. We do not have to execute this function manually, because it is inbuilt, and whenever there will be some change, it will execute. And by default, whenever will be some change, this event, whenever this will execute, it will return. The function will take event as an what? Event as an arguments, right? So all these things are happening inbuilt. Now, the same analogy we can use for this parent component new expense for its child to communicate with its child component expense form. Okay, so this parent component is calling its child component expense form. So let's pass the props, right? So let's call props as what? Let's use the same convention, like there was on change. So let's use on, and what we want to do, we want to save the expenses. So let's name it on save expense data. Okay, and since it will take a function, right? So let's use the same convention again, save expense data handler. Okay, and now we need to define this function into this parent component, just like in here, we are defining this function title change handler into this child component here, title change handler, right? So now here we will define this function save expense data handler into this function, this component itself. Let's save it into a const variable. Okay, now it will have an argument, and that argument will come from the child component. We will see how. For the time being, let's name it entered expense data. Okay, now let's go into the child component. Now, since the parent component have passed the props, so this component should be able to retrieve them using the props. Okay, and we want to execute this function, right? When we want to save the expenses, we want to save the expenses whenever user click the button of the form, right? So in this form, we have an event handler on submit, which is taking this function submit handler as a value, and this function we have defined here, submit handler, and again it is taking automatically an event, right, in its argument, and we're defining it. First we are preventing the default behavior of this event, like what happens in a form whenever user clicks on the button. By default, all the values gets empty, and the values, all the input field get empty, and the values stored in them sent to the backend server. But since we do not want them, we want to handle this data manually. That is why I am preventing this default behavior using event.prevent default, right? Now I'm creating this constant, this object here that I want to transfer to my parent component. That is why we are doing all these things. Okay, so I am writing this object. Its properties are title, object, amount, and date, and it's taking value from the entered title, entered amount, entered date. All these things are coming from the respective event handlers, right? So that must be easy part. Don't go into the comment section part. That part is basically because we have here three states which are changing as per the user entering. That is why I have tried handling them as a single state slices, and in the comment section I'm handling them as a multi-state slice approach. Since here I think it is better to go with single state slices, and I'm more comfortable in it. That is why I'm going with it. Okay, now in this submit handler event only, I want that function. Which function? This function to execute. Okay, so let's retrieve that. How to retrieve? We have passed it using props, and props we can retrieve easily on save expense data. We will call this function here. It will be called whenever the user click on the button. But on calling this function, we can pass data to that function as a parameter. We can pass this data as a parameter to this function. So let's pass it. And then, okay, so that's it. That's it from the component part. And then this expense data will be coming into this function, right? Because this function executed. So now, since this function executed, it is called, right? We are not executing it, we are calling it here. We're calling it here, passing expense data as a parameter. And then since it is now it is getting executed, and this entered expense data will take the same value as this expense data. Okay, and now we can create our own object here, const. Let's name it this. Let's name it same expense data is equal to, let's use destructuring properties, entered expense data, and voila. In this way, we can communicate from child component to parent component, right? So, okay, that's it from my side. I'm also learning these things, so just okay. So thank you.